The torches came first. Fort Smith, Arkansas. October 1877, 6:47 p.m. The sun was dropping behind the courthouse like it wanted no part of what was coming. Federal Deputy Marshal James Fagan saw them from the second-floor window. At first, 10 men, then 20, then 40. By 7 o'clock, over 70 men had gathered on Garrison Avenue, the wide dirt street that ran straight past the United States District Court for the Western District of Arkansas. They carried torches, rifles, axe handles. Some wore bandanas over their faces. Others did not bother hiding. They wanted to be seen. They wanted Judge Isaac Charles Parker to look out his window and understand what was waiting for him. Inside that courthouse, a trial was underway. 3 white men from Sebastian County charged with the murder of a black farmer named Elijah Tate. Tate had owned 40 acres outside Fort Smith. 40 acres he had worked with his own hands since 1869. 40 acres that certain men believed a black man had no right to own. They shot him on his porch on a Sunday evening in August, while his wife and 2 children watched from behind the door. Then they burned his barn. Then they rode away laughing because they believed what they had always believed, that no court in Arkansas would convict a white man for killing a black farmer, that the system would protect them the way it always had. They were wrong, because the court in Fort Smith was not like any other court in the South. The court in Fort Smith belonged to Isaac Parker. Parker had arrived in Fort Smith in May 1875. He was 36 years old, appointed by President Ulysses S. Grant to bring law to a jurisdiction that covered over 74,000 square miles of Indian territory, a jurisdiction so lawless that his predecessor had been removed for corruption, a jurisdiction where murder was casual, robbery was constant, and justice was a word people used but nobody practiced. Parker changed that on his first day. Within his first session, he tried 18 men for murder. 15 were convicted. 6 were sentenced to hang. On September 3, 1875, he hanged all 6 at once on a specially built gallows in the courthouse yard. The message was clear. Federal law had arrived, and federal law did not negotiate. But Parker did something else that made certain men hate him more than the gallows ever could. He enforced the law equally. Black witnesses testified in his court. Black jurors sat in his jury box. Black victims received the same justice as white ones. And white men who killed black citizens were prosecuted with the same fury as any other murderer. In 1877, in the post-Reconstruction South, this was not just unusual. This was revolutionary. And to certain men in western Arkansas and Indian Territory, it was unforgivable. Now think about that for a second. A federal judge in the 1870s South treating black lives as equal under the law. How many enemies do you think that made him? Drop your guess in the comments because the real number is going to shock you. The 3 men on trial for Elijah Tate's murder were connected, not just to each other, but to a network of night riders, former Confederate sympathizers, and organized hate that stretched across Sebastian and Crawford counties. They met in barns and back rooms. They planned raids on black farms, intimidated witnesses, threatened anyone who cooperated with Parker's court. For 2 years, they had operated in shadows. But Parker had a weapon they had not anticipated, a weapon that tracked them through Indian territory like a ghost, that appeared at their doors in disguises they never saw through, that dragged them back to Fort Smith in chains no matter how far they ran. That weapon was a man, 6 feet 2 inches tall, left-handed, could not read or write, but could track a horse across stone and shoot a silver dollar out of the air at 75 feet. Born into slavery in 1838 in Crawford County, Arkansas. Escaped bondage during the Civil War, lived among the Cherokee and Creek nations, learned their languages, learned their land, learned how to survive in territory that killed most men who entered it. In 1875, Judge Parker appointed him United States Deputy Marshal. His name was Bass Reeves. Reeves had already arrested over 200 fugitives by October 1877. Men who thought the territory would swallow them, men who believed no lawman would follow them into the winding Stair Mountains or across the Red River. Reeves followed them all, alone, no posse, no backup, no safety net. Just his badge, his Winchester, his 2 Colt revolvers, and an understanding of the land that no white marshal could match. He brought them back alive when he could. He brought them back dead when he had to. Either way, they came back. And this fact, this reality of a black man in a federal badge dragging white fugitives into Parker's court, was the thing that burned hottest in the hearts of the men now gathering outside the courthouse with torches. The trial of the 3 men accused of killing Elijah Tate had been proceeding for 2 days. 2 black witnesses had already testified. Martha Tate, Elijah's widow, had sat in that witness chair and described watching her husband die. Her voice shook but did not break. The jury, which included 2 black men, had listened in silence. The evidence was overwhelming. Eyewitness testimony, physical evidence, the defendant's own statements to neighbors, bragging about what they had done. Conviction was almost certain. And that was exactly why the mob had come. The first signs appeared at 4 p.m. on the second day. A group of 8 men on horseback rode slowly down Garrison Avenue, making no attempt to hide the rifles across their saddles. They stopped in front of the courthouse, dismounted, and stood in a loose line facing the building. Court officer Samuel Peters watched from the front steps. "Something is happening," he told Deputy Marshal George Winston. Winston looked out the window. More riders were coming from the east, from the direction of Jenny Lind and Hackett, small towns where sympathy for the defendants ran deep. By 5:30, the crowd had tripled. Men on foot joined the riders. Some carried signs. One read federal law stops at the Arkansas line. Another read Parker has no authority over free white men. A third simply read go home. By 6 o'clock, the crowd was blocking the courthouse entrance. Witnesses scheduled to testify the next morning could not reach the building. 2 black jurors were confronted on Rogers Avenue and told that if they returned to the courthouse, their families would pay the price. One of those jurors, a freedman named Isaiah Cole, had served on 3 previous Parker juries. He had never missed a day. That evening, for the first time, Isaiah Cole did not come home. His wife found him hiding in a neighbor's root cellar, shaking. "They told me they would burn my house," Isaiah said. "They told me they would hang me from the same tree they used on Elijah." At 6:30 p.m., Marshal Daniel Upham, the chief U.S. Marshal for the district, entered Parker's chambers. "Judge, we have a situation." Parker was at his desk reviewing testimony transcripts. He did not look up. "Describe it." "Between 70 and 80 men outside, armed, blocking the entrance. 2 jurors have been threatened. I have received reports that witnesses have been told not to return tomorrow." Parker set down his pen, looked up. His eyes were the color of winter iron. "Who is leading them?" Upham hesitated. "We believe a man named William Garrett, former Confederate captain, connected to the night rider activity in Sebastian County. His brother is one of the defendants." Parker nodded slowly, then stood, walked to his window, looked down at Garrison Avenue. The torches made the evening glow orange. The shouts were audible even through closed glass. Noise without meaning. Rage without reason. Men who believed that volume and violence could overpower the law. Parker turned back to Upham. "I want warrants drawn immediately. Obstruction of justice. Intimidation of federal witnesses. Conspiracy to interfere with proceedings of a United States court. Every man down there who can be identified by name gets a warrant." Upham nodded, but his face showed concern. "Judge, I have 6 deputies available. Most are out on assignment in the territory. 6 against 80 is not favorable math. I am not sending 6. How many then?" "1. Upham stared. "1 deputy, Judge?" "1 deputy. the right one. Send for Bass Reeves. The message reached Reeves at 7:15 p.m. He was camped 12 miles south of Fort Smith on the road back from Indian Territory, bringing in a horse thief he had tracked for 9 days. Illinois Creek, his occasional riding partner, was with him. Reeves read the message. Or rather, Creek read it to him, as Reeves had never learned to read. Creek's face changed as he spoke the words. They want you to ride into Fort Smith alone, into a crowd of 70 armed men. Tonight, Reeves was quiet for a moment. He was cleaning his Winchester, the same way he cleaned it every night. Methodical, precise. Then he stood, put on his long black coat, checked both revolvers, slid the Winchester into his saddle scabbard, and mounted his horse. A large sorrel gelding that had carried him across 3,000 miles of territory without ever going lame. "You are going," Creek said. It was not a question. "Judge Parker asked for me. That is enough." Creek shook his head. One man against a mob is not law enforcement. That is suicide. Reeves looked at Creek with eyes that had seen things most men could not imagine. Eyes that had watched his enslaver beat his mother. Eyes that had navigated the darkest nights of Indian Territory alone. Eyes that had never once looked away from what needed to be done. It is not suicide if you do not intend to die. Then he rode north, alone, toward the torches. If you are watching this, and you are already feeling the tension, hit subscribe right now, because this story is about to go somewhere you did not expect. Reeves reached the outskirts of Fort Smith at 8:40 p.m. He could see the glow from Garrison Avenue half a mile out, could hear the noise, the shouting, the ugly rhythm of men feeding each other's anger. He slowed his horse to a walk, not because he was afraid, because Bass Reeves never rushed. Every arrest he had ever made followed the same principle: calm, controlled, absolute. Panic was for amateurs. Reeves was a professional. He entered Garrison Avenue from the south end. The street was wide, over 80 feet across, built for wagon traffic and cattle drives. Tonight, it was full of men. Torchlight threw shadows that danced across storefronts. Horses were tied to posts along both sides. The smell of whiskey and smoke hung in the air like weather. Reeves rode straight up the center of the street. His badge was pinned to his coat, visible, deliberate. The torchlight caught it and threw the reflection back like a small cold star. The first men to notice him went quiet, then the ones next to them, then the ones behind. Silence spread through the crowd like a wave moving backward, starting at the front where Reeves was riding and rolling toward the courthouse steps. By the time Reeves was 50 feet from the main group, the shouting had stopped completely. 70 men stood in the orange light and watched a single black marshal ride toward them, like the night itself had taken a shape and put on a badge. William Garrett was standing on the courthouse steps. Tall, red-faced, a former cavalry officer who still carried himself like a man, accustomed to giving orders and having them followed. He had a pistol on his hip and a rifle leaning against the railing behind him. When he saw Reeves, his face went through several expressions: surprise, confusion, Then something harder, something uglier. They sent you, Garrett said. His voice carried across the silent street. Of all the men they could have sent, they sent you. Reeves brought his horse to a stop 15 feet from the steps. Did not dismount? Not yet. Sat tall in the saddle, the Winchester across his lap, the reins loose in his left hand. His voice was deep, steady, the kind of voice that filled a space without shouting. William Garrett. I hold a warrant issued by the United States District Court for the Western District of Arkansas, signed by Judge Isaac C. Parker, for your arrest on charges of obstruction of justice, intimidation of federal witnesses, and conspiracy to interfere with proceedings of a federal court. You will surrender your weapons and submit to arrest. The silence that followed was absolute. 70 men holding their breath. Garrett stared at Reeves, then laughed. One man, one colored lawman, against all of us. You think that badge protects you here? This badge does not protect me, Reeves said. This badge protects the law, and the law says you are under arrest. Now you can come quietly, or you can make this difficult. But either way, Mr. Garrett, you are coming with me. Garrett's hand moved toward his pistol. Not fast, testing, feeling for the moment. Reeves did not move, did not flinch, did not blink. And that stillness, that absolute absence of fear, was more terrifying than any threat could have been. Because the men in that crowd had seen scared lawmen before, had seen deputies back down, ride away, make excuses, had seen the law bend when enough pressure was applied, but they had never seen this. A man who simply did not care about the odds, who looked at 70 armed men the way a stone looks at a river, unmoved, permanent. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever stood alone against a crowd? Not 70 armed men, maybe just a room full of people who disagreed with you. That feeling in your chest, that pressure, multiply it by 1,000. That is what Reeves felt every single day of his career, and he never once backed down. Let me know in the comments if you think you could have done what he did, because honestly, most of us could not. A man in the crowd, someone behind Garrett, raised a rifle, pointed it at Reeves. The click of the hammer was loud in the silence. Reeves's eyes shifted to the man, just his eyes. The rest of his body stayed perfectly still. You can pull that trigger, Reeves said calmly, and you might hit me. But before I fall, I will put 2 rounds in Mr. Garrett's chest and 1 in yours. And then Judge Parker will send every marshal in the territory after every man standing on this street tonight. And they will find you. They always find you. I always find you. The man with the rifle looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at Reeves, and in that moment, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with a shout or a charge. Just a quiet rearrangement of power. The crowd understood, maybe for the first time, that this was not a negotiation. This was an arrest. And the man making it would die before he failed to carry it out. Garrett's hand moved away from his pistol. Slowly, he swallowed hard. His pride was choking him, but his survival instinct was stronger. Reeves dismounted. The movement was fluid, practiced, the motion of a man who had gotten off a horse 10,000 times and never once been caught off balance. He walked toward Garrett, each step deliberate, his boots loud on the wooden steps. He pulled the iron shackles from his belt. The sound of chain was clear and final. Turn around, Reeves said. Garrett turned. Reeves cuffed him, then reached into his coat and pulled out 4 more warrants. Read each name aloud. Thomas Pruitt, James Hensley, Robert Dale, Samuel Kern. Federal warrants for obstruction of justice and intimidation of witnesses before a United States court. Surrender immediately or face additional charges of resisting a federal officer. 4 men in the crowd. 4 men who had been brave enough to threaten jurors and witnesses in the dark. 4 men who now stood in torchlight, watching a single marshal call their names and felt something they had never expected to feel. Fear, real fear. The kind that makes your legs heavy and your mouth dry. The kind that tells you the game is over and the consequences are real. Thomas Pruitt stepped forward first, dropped his rifle, turned around without being told. Reeves cuffed him. James Hensley came next, then Robert Dale, each one silent, each one understanding that resistance was no longer an option. Not because Reeves had an army behind him. He did not. Not because the crowd had turned against them. It had not. But because something in Reeves's presence, in his stillness, in the absolute certainty of his authority, made fighting feel pointless, like arguing with gravity. Samuel Kern was the last. He was younger than the others, maybe 22, and his hands were shaking. He had a knife on his belt, but made no move toward it. Reeves looked at him. "You are young," Reeves said quietly, "young enough to learn from this. Put the knife down and come with me." Kern put the knife down. Reeves cuffed him. 5 men in irons, 5 warrants served. 1 marshal. 70 witnesses who would tell this story for the rest of their lives. Reeves walked his 5 prisoners down the courthouse steps and through the crowd. The mob parted. Not quickly, not dramatically. Slowly, like men waking from a dream they did not understand. Reeves walked through the center of them, prisoners in a line behind him, his Winchester in his right hand, his eyes forward. Nobody touched him. Nobody blocked his path. Nobody said a word. Because what do you say to a man who just did what Bass Reeves did? What words exist for that kind of courage? At the courthouse door, Marshal Upham was waiting with 2 deputies. Reeves handed over the prisoners. 5 for Judge Parker. Warrants served. Upham looked at Reeves, at the crowd behind him, at the 5 men in chains. 5 arrests. No shots fired. Against 70 men. Reeves adjusted his hat. They were not 70 men. They were 70 scared people pretending to be brave. Scared people always back down when they meet someone who is not pretending. Inside the courthouse, Parker was still at his desk. He had not left, had not gone to the window to watch. He did not need to. He had sent Bass Reeves. That was enough. When Upham reported the arrests, Parker nodded once. "Schedule their arraignment for tomorrow morning, first thing, and send word to the jurors and witnesses. This court is open. It will remain open. No mob, no threat, no gathering of cowards will close it." The trial of the 3 men accused of murdering Elijah Tate resumed the next morning at 9 a.m. All 12 jurors were present, including Isaiah Cole, who had walked to the courthouse at dawn, head high, fear still in his chest, but something stronger in his spine. Martha Tate returned to testify. Her voice did not shake this time. Outside, Garrison Avenue was empty. No torches, no signs, no horses tied to posts. The crowd had dissolved in the night like fog burning off under morning sun. Some had ridden home. Others had slipped into saloons and pretended they had never been there. William Garrett and the 4 others sat in the basement cells of the courthouse, waiting for their own trials. The message had been delivered, not with speeches, not with armies, with 1 man in 5 sets of handcuffs. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 14 minutes, guilty on all 3 counts. Judge Parker sentenced each defendant to death by hanging. The execution was carried out on January 11, 1878, on Parker's gallows in the courthouse yard. 3 men who had believed they could murder a black farmer and face no consequences learned, at the end of a rope, that federal law did not share their beliefs. William Garrett was convicted of obstruction of justice and intimidation of federal witnesses. Sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. He served 6. When he was released, he moved to Texas. He never returned to Fort Smith, never spoke publicly about the night he was arrested. But people who knew him said he was different after prison, quieter, smaller somehow, like something had been taken from him that he could never get back. Pruitt, Hensley, Dale and Kern received sentences ranging from 3 to 5 years. Kern, the youngest, served his time and afterward became a farmer in Oklahoma Territory. Years later, a reporter asked him about that night in Fort Smith. Kern was an old man by then, weathered and quiet. He said one thing, "I have seen a lot of men in my life. Brave men, strong men, dangerous men. But I never saw anything like Bass Reeves walking through that crowd alone. It was not courage. Courage is when you are afraid and you do it anyway. Reeves was not afraid. He simply knew he was right. And when a man knows he is right the way Reeves knew it, there is nothing on earth that can stop him. Nothing." Bass Reeves served as a United States Deputy Marshal for 32 years. In that time, he arrested over 3,000 felons. He was never wounded by a suspect, though his hat was shot off twice and his belt buckle was hit once. He rode alone into Indian Territory more times than anyone could count. He wore disguises, posed as a drifter, a preacher, a farmer, once even an outlaw. He brought back men who had sworn they would die before they went to Parker's court. They did not die. They went to court because Reeves was better than they were, smarter, tougher, more patient, more relentless. He could not read or write his entire life. Every warrant he served, he memorized. Court clerks would read the warrants to him, and Reeves would hold each name, each charge, each detail in his mind with perfect accuracy. He never served the wrong warrant, never arrested the wrong man. His memory was his weapon as much as his Winchester. In 1902, Judge Isaac Parker died on November 17, 1896, at the age of 58. He had served 21 years on the bench. In that time, he had tried over 13,000 cases, sentenced 160 men to death, and seen 79 of them hanged. 65 of his deputy marshals were killed in the line of duty. Parker worked himself to exhaustion and died of kidney failure, still fighting for the jurisdiction he believed in. On his deathbed, he said, "I have ever had the single aim of justice in view. No judge who has ever combated did more hard, persistent work than I. Do me justice." The relationship between Parker and Reeves was more than professional. It was foundational. Parker needed Reeves because Reeves could go where no white marshal could go, could earn trust in communities that had no reason to trust a badge, could move through Indian Territory like water through stone. And Reeves needed Parker because Parker was the one judge in the American South who treated a black lawman as exactly what he was, a United States officer with full authority and full respect. Together, they created something that should not have been possible in post-Civil War America. A court where the law was blind, where a black marshal arrested white criminals and a white judge sentenced them, where hate came to the courthouse door and was turned away by a man on a horse with a badge and a Winchester and a refusal, an absolute refusal, to be afraid. If you made it this far, you already know this is not just a history lesson. This is a story about what one person can do when they decide that fear is not an option. Subscribe if you liked this video, because there are more stories like this coming. Stories that did not make the textbooks. Stories that should have. Fort Smith, Arkansas still stands. The courthouse is a National Historic Site now. You can visit it. You can walk the same halls where Parker delivered his verdicts. You can see the gallows reconstructed where justice was carried out. And if you stand on Garrison Avenue and look south toward the river, you can imagine a single rider coming up that wide dirt street in the torchlight. Alone, unhurried, the badge on his coat catching the firelight. The silence spreading through the crowd like a confession nobody wanted to make. Parker's court was surrounded by hate. 70 men with torches and rifles thought they could shut it down, thought numbers and rage and the old familiar terror of the mob could overpower federal law. They were wrong, because Parker did not send an army. He sent Bass Reeves, one man, one badge, one set of handcuffs at a time, and that was enough. more than enough. It was everything. In the history of American law enforcement, there are famous names: Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, Pat Garrett. Names that became legends, that filled books and movies and television screens. Bass Reeves arrested more fugitives than all of them combined, served longer, rode harder, faced worse odds, and did it all as a black man in an America that did not want him to exist, let alone succeed. He never got a movie in his lifetime, never got a book, never got the recognition that lesser men received for lesser deeds. But Harlem is not the only community that remembers its protectors. Fort Smith remembers. Indian Territory remembers. History, when it is told honestly, remembers. Bass Reeves died on January 12, 1910, in Muskogee, Oklahoma. He was 71 years old. He had been sick for months, kidney failure, the same disease that had taken Judge Parker 14 years earlier. As if even in death, the marshal followed his judge. The Muskogee newspaper ran a short obituary. It called him one of the bravest men this country has ever known. Then the world moved on, forgot, let the name fade the way America has always let black heroism fade, into footnotes and whispers and stories told on porches that nobody outside the community ever heard. But here is the thing about Bass Reeves. He did not do what he did for recognition, did not ride alone into that crowd for applause, did not arrest 3,000 fugitives for a statue or a movie deal. He did it because it was right, because the law was the law, because someone had to ride into the dark and bring justice back, and he decided, every single day for 32 years, that someone would be him. When a mob thought numbers and rage could silence federal justice, one black marshal proved them wrong. Bass Reeves walked through the storm of hate, warrants in hand, and turned intimidation into accountability. In the Wild West, no crowd, no threat, no ring of torches could overpower the unbreakable enforcer who rode for the law. Reeves made sure the hanging judge's gavel kept ringing, and it rang loud, and it rang clear, and it rang for everyone. So let me ask you one final question. When the law fails, when the system bends, when the mob gathers and the torches come out, what does justice look like? Does it look like an army? Does it look like a speech? Or does it look like one man on a horse, riding alone into the fire, because somebody had to and nobody else would? Drop your answer in the comments. And subscribe if you liked this video, because the story of Bass Reeves is not over. We are just getting started. There are rides you have not heard about, arrests that will leave you speechless, disguises so brilliant you will not believe they worked. And every single one of them happened. Every single one is real. Bass Reeves, the greatest lawman you were never taught about. Remember the name.